The sleet was falling sideways when Clara Bennett hit her knees in the frozen mud. Her scream vanished into the trees swallowed by the night and the hiss of wagon wheels grinding over slush. She barely managed to keep one arm wrapped around her belly, already rock-hard with labor, while the other reached toward the shrinking lantern light at the back of the wagon. They didn't even slow down. "You're a liability, Clara." Boone McCready had spat the bandit leader's voice slicing colder than the wind. "Ain't no one brings twins into a heist and survives." He'd smirked as he cracked the reins, never looking back. The trail disappeared into the darkness, and then it was only the trees. Clara slumped against a half-rotted log, her breath-shallow blood pooling beneath her. Somewhere deep inside her body was splitting apart, and there wasn't a soul in miles to hear her cry out. She grit her teeth, pulled the torn remains of her coat tighter around her, and prepared for a birth no woman should have to face alone. Her hands dug into the icy dirt, clawing for strength. The pain came in waves, unrelenting, volcanic, ancient. Clara had grown up tough in the mining towns of Arizona Territory, where women buried husbands and brothers with their own two hands. But this was something else. And as the snow thickened and her cries turned hoarse, the forest seemed to watch her with indifferent eyes. Just past midnight, the first baby came a boy, slick and purple, wriggling weakly in the open air. Clara cut the cord with her teeth, swaddled him in the flannel lining of her coat, and cried out again. The second followed minutes later, another boy, this one barely breathing. Her tears froze on her cheeks as she curled them both into her chest, whispering, "You will not die. Not here." Clara's body gave out shortly after that. Her head slumped against the cold bark and her breathing slowed to a rasp. Still, she pressed the babies close, trying to warm them with the last heat she had. Somewhere in the forest, a shadow moved. Rafe Whitehawk crouched beneath a cedar, his bow across his lap, eyes narrowed beneath the hood of a worn buffalo hide cloak. Son of a respected Comanche war leader, Rafe had been tracking Boone's gang since they'd raided a merchant caravan 3 days prior. He had expected stolen goods, maybe blood. What he hadn't expected was the sound that met his ears now, the small broken cry of an infant. Not pain, not mourning, something new, something helpless. He should have turned away. Rafe's past was carved with fire. White men had torched his family's winter lodge when he was a boy. He'd buried his mother with his bare hands. He'd once vowed never to lift a finger for anyone outside his people again. But that sound, it crawled into his bones. He found her there, barely breathing, the children curled against her. One of the babies had slipped down its lips, tinged blue. Without thinking, Rafe dropped from his horse and crossed the snow. Clara flinched when his shadow fell over her, her cracked lips trembling as she whispered, "Please." He didn't answer. He was already pulling the hide blanket from his saddle and wrapping the babies, checking their pulses with fingers rough from years of archery and rope work. Clara's own pulse was faint but present. Her cheeks burned with fever. She wouldn't last the night. For them, he muttered in Comanche, more to the wind than to her. "Not for you." He gathered her into his arms like she weighed no more than a bundle of reeds and carried all three toward the ridge. His boots crunched softly in the snow, and above them the moon was full, a white guardian in the black sky. Behind them, the forest closed in cold silent and unaware that it had just released its grip on 3 small, stubborn lives. By the time Rafe reached the camp, nestled in a valley below, the firelight was low and the night thick with frost. He didn't speak to anyone, just nodded once at the elders who stepped aside and took the woman and her sons to the medicine lodge. When Clara's eyes blinked open, it was hours later, her limbs heavy, her throat sandpaper dry. The room smelled of smoke, herbs, and hide. She wasn't dead. She wasn't freezing anymore. A soft mat cradled her back, and to her left, her boys lay bundled in warm furs, breathing alive. She cried silently, then not from pain, but from the stunning realization that somehow they had made it. At the flap of the lodge, a figure moved. She tensed, curling around the children. But it was not danger that entered, it was age. An older Comanche woman with braids silvered by time and eyes like deep water. The woman said nothing. She placed a bowl of steaming porridge and a carved bone spoon beside Clara's mat, then stepped out into the cold morning air as quietly as she had come. Alone again, Clara breathed in the scent of her babies, her boys. For the first time since her husband died, someone had named something that was hers. She hadn't asked for it. She didn't know if she'd earned it. But there they were, sleeping and warm, and so was she. Outside, the first glow of dawn crept over the mountains. Inside, in the still hush of a Comanche camp, a mother and her sons lived. And somewhere in the shadows beyond a warrior who had once sworn he'd never help a white soul again, sat alone in the dark, listening to the fire crackle, wondering why the sound of newborn cries still echoed in his chest. Rafe sat at the edge of the camp, his fingers idle, sharpening a blade that did not need sharpening. Smoke curled from a nearby fire pit, and the soft murmur of waking voices drifted through the stillness. He'd brought back the woman and her children, but he hadn't stayed to explain. He didn't know anyone that. He hadn't even asked her name. Inside the medicine lodge, Clara stirred again. Her ribs still ached, but the burning fever had dulled, held at bay by the warmth and the medicine. She reached for her sons, checking their foreheads, brushing the soft down of their hair. They were still here, still alive. She didn't understand why or how, but someone had chosen not to leave them behind. That someone returned just after sunrise. The flap of the lodge stirred, and Clara flinched again, protective, wary. The tall figure stepped in his shoulders, filling the entrance, his eyes unreadable. He carried a rabbit already skinned and cleaned. Clara recognized him instantly, the one who'd appeared in the trees just before she passed out. The man who had saved her. She braced herself, voice sharp. "Don't come closer. I won't let anyone hurt them." He didn't respond immediately, just crouched beside the fire circle and placed the rabbit down near the untouched bowl of porridge. His gaze slid to hers, not threatening, not soft, just assessing. Then, in slow accented English, he said, "Eat, then feed them." That was all. He turned to leave, but Clara caught something in the movement of his hands. The calluses, the scars, the marks of a man who'd worked with tools, not just weapons. He left without another word. Hours passed. Clara finally dipped the spoon into the thick mixture and ate. It wasn't much, but it quieted the aching in her belly. The babies stirred. She nursed them slowly, her arms trembling. Each breath reminded her she was still in foreign territory, an uninvited guest in a place she'd once feared as a child. When she finally stepped outside that afternoon, the world looked different. Softer, maybe. Or maybe she was just too tired to be afraid. She wore a sling made from softened hide, both boys tucked inside against her chest. The cold air bit at her skin, but she moved slowly through the camp, eyes forward. Children ran past her laughing. Women gathered herbs, stirred pots, sharpened tools. No one stopped her, but no one smiled either. Some glanced sideways. Others averted their eyes entirely. She felt the weight of their stares on her back like stones. And then came the first words, harsh, sharp, and full of fire. "You shouldn't be here." Clara turned, startled. A young Comanche woman stood across the clearing, her arms folded, dark eyes narrowed. Her braids swung forward as she stepped closer. "You're a ghost lover, a trespasser. You carry their blood on our land." Clara straightened her back. "I didn't ask to be here, but here you are," the woman hissed. She reached into a pouch and pulled out something gray and crumbly ashes. "Go before I scatter your breath to the wind." Before Clara could speak, a voice boomed across the camp. "Stop!" It was Rafe. He stepped into view from the shadows near the fire pit, his jaw clenched tight. His eyes, usually still as stone, were burning now. "No one harms the mother of the ones I brought back." The camp fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The woman, Taya they called her, glared at Clara one last time before storming off, her hand clenched around the ash. Clara stood frozen. Her heart pounded in her ears. She looked at Rafe, unsure of what to say. "Why did you say that?" she asked, finally, voice low. He didn't look at her, just stared toward the horizon. "I didn't say it for you." "Then why?" "For them." He nodded to the babies sleeping against her chest. "I will not let them be hated for what they cannot change." She swallowed. "You could have left me." "I have, before," he said, his voice quieter now. "Once. A woman cried for help. I walked away. I still remember her face." The wind whispered through the tall grass. Clara didn't speak. She didn't know how to respond to a confession like that. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Rafe returned to the lodge. He found her inside, one baby fussing with a cloth diaper, the other dozing. He crouched nearby, watching helplessly as the infant squirmed. "You're doing it wrong," Clara murmured, her voice almost amused. He looked up, sheepish. She reached over, guiding his fingers, folding the edge just so, not too tight. Like this. Their hands brushed. A flicker passed between them, not romantic, not yet, but real. Recognition, maybe. The beginning of something neither of them had a name for. That night, they stacked firewood side by side. He placed his bundle down first. She followed hers beside his. Their fingers touched again briefly. No one spoke of gratitude. But it was there in the quiet, in the shared work, in the way he waited for her to finish before walking away. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. And as the wind stirred the embers of the fire and the babies whimpered softly in their sleep, Clara understood something she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The morning broke with the sound of children's laughter and the rhythmic hiss of water boiling over coals. Smoke drifted lazily through the Comanche camp as the tribe stirred to life. Clara sat in the doorway of the lodge, both twins wrapped tightly to her chest in the sling Rafe had fashioned from softened elk hide. Their cheeks were flushed with health, their small breaths warm against her skin. She hadn't planned to step outside again. But something about the way the light filtered through the smoke that morning made her legs move before she could change her mind. She didn't know where she was going, just that staying hidden felt like disappearing, and she'd had enough of that. The camp wasn't what she'd imagined it would be. As a child, she'd heard stories, terrifying stories of Comanche warriors who took captives and never gave them back, of women who vanished on the frontier. But this place wasn't like those stories. It was quieter, more human. An older woman sitting near a central cooking fire gave Clara a slight nod, not of welcome, but of recognition. It startled her more than open hostility might have. She nodded back, unsure what to do with the thin thread of connection. Then came a voice, young, cheerful, from behind her. "Name's a boy?" asked, pointing at each of the babies in turn. Clara blinked. "Excuse me." He grinned, a tooth missing in front. "We call that one Swano." He tapped the twin with the darker hair. Means wind. And that one, he gestured at the lighter-eyed baby. Nawi, light. Clara's throat tightened. No one had named anything of hers in a long time. No one had dared to claim her boys as something worth naming. She whispered a thank you, though her voice caught on the last syllable. By midday, she found herself near the outer edge of the camp, watching older boys practice with wooden spears while younger girls wove baskets. No one asked her to leave, but she still felt the invisible border she wasn't meant to cross. Every sideways glance, every whisper reminded her she was different. An outsider. A survivor, perhaps, but not one of them. Rafe emerged from the brush carrying a bundle of fresh wood. His face was marked with sweat and dust, his movements slow but efficient. He didn't speak as he passed by her, but their eyes met, and that was enough. She saw something there, not affection, not yet, but an acknowledgement, a shared understanding. But peace didn't last long. Later that afternoon, the camp stilled. Hoofbeats echoed across the clearing, low and heavy, like the sound of drums before battle. Warriors moved quickly, bowstrings tightening, voices hushed. Rafe appeared beside Clara before she could react. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and calm. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, pale-skinned, rifles slung over their shoulders. One limped badly. Another looked near collapse. Their horses were gaunt ribs showing. These weren't raiders. Not anymore. Clara stepped forward before she could think better of it. She felt every eye on her. "They're wounded," she said, raising a hand. "Let me speak." Rafe didn't move. He looked at her, his jaw tight, but he gave a slight nod. She turned to the men. "Why are you here?" The older rider dismounted stiffly. He tipped his hat with shaking fingers. "We ain't here to hurt no one, ma'am. We were ambushed 2 days south. Bandits. Lost 2 men. No food left. No medicine. We heard there might be healing hands in these parts. Took a chance." Their faces were hollow with hunger and loss. These were not the men who had abandoned her, but they wore the same dust, the same smell of desperation. Clara turned to Rafe. "Let them rest. We treat their wounds. It means more than saving just them." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the camp, the children playing the elders, cooking the soft peace that had taken years to build. Then he gave a single nod. The warriors lowered their weapons. That night, the strangers slept in borrowed hides wounds treated with herbal salves. Clara brought them water, and one of the older women brought broth. No one spoke loudly, but the tension was a little looser, the lines a little less defined. Later, under the light of the fire, Taya returned. She wasn't angry this time, just curious. She stood near Clara, arms folded swano, cradled gently against her shoulder. "You trust them?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I trust what I see," Clara replied. "Not what others tell me to hate." Taya looked down at the baby. His tiny hand grasped her necklace, pulling softly. She smiled, a rare thing on her face. "He's not afraid." "No one is born with hate," Clara said. "Someone has to teach it." Taya didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. She stayed there beside Clara, rocking Swano gently until the fire burned low. Across the camp, Rafe watched them, arms crossed. He said nothing. But the look in his eyes wasn't just of a man standing guard. It was a man watching something he didn't know he needed until it stood before him. The spring wind came early that year, curling through the tall grass and shaking loose the last of the frost. Clara stood near the edge of the camp with one twin nestled on her hip while the other slept. The light played over her braided hair, the single feather tied at the end swaying in the breeze. She wore a simple dress sewn by the elder women, hand-stitched rough at the seams, but stronger than it looked. Like her, she hadn't intended to attend the fire gathering. The great bonfire had been lit at dusk, a sacred rite, to welcome new life, new seasons, and to mark decisions that could not be unmade. Rafe hadn't said a word about it, but one of the older women had taken Clara's hand that evening and silently led her toward the firelight. Now she stood at the outer ring of the clearing as music rose, flutes, drums, laughter rippling like warm water. Sparks spiraled into the night sky. The dancers moved slowly at first, then, with rising rhythm, younger couples shyly watching each other across the fire. There was no priest, no altar, just a circle of flame and the quiet ceremony of choice. Near the flames stood Rafe, arms folded, expression unreadable. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, not as a warrior searching for danger, but as a man looking for something unspoken. Or maybe someone. Then a moment of stillness. The chief stepped forward. A tall man with a silver braid and a voice like carved granite. He called out in Comanche, his tone calm but firm. "My son," he said, his gaze fixed on Rafe. "The camp wonders. Why did you bring her? Why did you break your vow? Why risk everything for a woman who is not of our blood?" Clara's stomach twisted. Her heart pounded against the sling. Even the fire seemed to hush. Rafe stepped forward into the circle, the firelight casting gold and shadow across his face. When he spoke, his voice did not tremble. "I did not bring her here," he said. "I brought home my family." A ripple passed through the crowd. Soft gasps, a few startled exhalations. "I do not speak of blood," he continued. "I speak of what is born in fire." She did not ask to be here. She did not beg. She protected. She bled. She endured. She learned. She became. Then he turned not to the chief, but to Clara. "I broke a vow," he said, "but I found something worth breaking it for." The chief studied him in silence. Then, slowly, he stepped back. The drums resumed. Clara stood frozen, her hands clenched tightly around the sling. She had never been claimed before, not by her late husband, not by any family. No one had ever called her home, and Rafe had just done it in front of everyone. Her breath caught. Her legs moved before her mind did. She stepped forward through the firelight. No words came. They didn't need to. Instead, she placed one hand over her heart, then laid it gently on Rafe's chest. That was her answer. From the shadows, a young girl approached and pressed something into Clara's palm, a small wooden carving of a hawk, its wings curved in flight. "He made it," the girl whispered. Clara traced the rough edges with her thumb. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was strong, like the man who had carved it. She didn't drop it. She didn't return it. She held it close. Later that night, the camp quieted. Couples vanished into the trees. The fire dimmed its glow soft over the empty circle. Clara sat beside the lodge with the twins sleeping beside her. Rafe walked by, slowing as he reached her. She looked up. "You meant it?" she asked softly. "Family." He nodded once. "Even me." This time, he didn't use words. He simply knelt and picked up one of the boys with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. He held the child close, gazing at the small wrinkled face with quiet reverence. For the first time in months, Clara felt something steady in her chest. Not just relief, belonging, but peace was fragile, and spring storms come without warning. The next evening, the rain came hard, slashing sideways, soaking everything. The camp retreated under hides and tents. Fires hissed and died. Inside the lodge, Clara leaned over Nawi, her hand pressed to his forehead. Too hot. The baby whimpered, twisting in his sleep skin blotched red. His breath came short, rasping like dry paper. Swano lay nearby, fussing in sympathy, though he wasn't fevered. Clara's heart thundered with fear. "Please," she whispered to the dark, "please stay with me." The elder women brought herbs, ground roots, heated stones. Nothing worked. By midnight, Clara hadn't slept. She held Nawi to her chest, humming broken lullabies through tears. Rafe entered silently, soaked to the skin. One glance at the baby and his jaw tightened. "This isn't a common sickness," he said. "He's dying, isn't he?" Her voice cracked like thin glass. Rafe didn't answer. Instead, he strapped on his satchel. "Where are you going?" she demanded. "There's another tribe. 2 days south. Their healer knows the route that brings down heat." Clara grabbed his wrist. "They won't help you. They don't even like you. You could be killed. I have to try." He was gone into the storm. Clara sat beside the fire through the night, cradling her son, her body stiff with dread. Twice she crawled outside and screamed into the rain. "Take me, if it saves him. Take me." At dawn, just as the sky blushed red behind the hills, a cry rang out from the ridge. Rafe stumbled into view, his horse trembling beneath him. His shirt was torn, blood staining his sleeve. He fell into Clara's arms, thrusting a leather pouch toward her. "Boil it," he gasped. Inside were bitter roots, twisted and dark. Clara rushed to the fire pit, fed the flames, and prepared the mixture. She fed Nawi in tiny spoonfuls. Then she waited. Minutes crawled. Hours passed. Day faded to night. The baby's fever broke just before dawn. His breathing eased. Clara collapsed beside the matte forehead pressed to his. Later, she found Rafe by the creek binding his own wound. The gash wasn't deep, but it was angry. "Let me," she said, kneeling. He didn't protest. She cleaned the cut with gentle fingers, then wrapped it tight with strips of hide. "If you hadn't come back," she started. Her voice broke. "I wouldn't have forgiven you." He looked at her eyes soft. "But you did, and I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," he said quietly, "when you called him ours." Her hand slipped into his, then no hesitation this time. And in the hush between them, something shifted again. Not survival, not fear, something new. The storm had passed, but the quiet it left behind felt fragile, like porcelain after an earthquake. Clara woke to birdsong and the faint scent of damp earth. She shifted beneath the furs and reached for her boys. Both were asleep, breath, steady limbs, soft and warm. She leaned down and kissed each forehead, pausing for a moment longer over Nawi's, feeling the warmth there, not fever, just life. Rafe was gone when she stepped outside, but she knew he wouldn't be far. Since returning with the healer's roots he'd taken to walk in the perimeter of the camp at dawn, watching, listening. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and carried the babies in their sling as she crossed the field toward the rise overlooking the ridge. He stood there, bow in hand, back straight, his long hair tied with a strip of hide. He didn't turn when she approached, but when she stopped beside him, he handed her a strip of dried meat without a word. They stood in silence for a while, watching the hills glow pink under the rising sun. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," she said finally. Rafe's brow furrowed. "It might," he replied, "but we'll meet it if it does." It didn't take long for his words to prove prophetic. By late morning, the camp's peaceful rhythm was disrupted again by hoof beats. 3 riders this time, slow, cautious, their hands raised in the universal sign of surrender. They were white men, older than the outlaws who had abandoned Clara, but scarred in similar ways. One clutched his side, another limped heavily. Their horses were thin and trembling from exhaustion. Clara stepped forward again, this time with a clearer voice and steadier legs. "Let me speak." Rafe didn't object. He simply stood behind her arms, folded, watching every movement with the eyes of someone who had lost too much to be careless. The oldest of the riders dismounted, hat in hand. "We don't want trouble, ma'am. We were ambushed south of here. Lost our supplies. Heard you might have help. Took a gamble." Clara looked to Rafe. His face was stone unreadable, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the twitch in his fingers near the bowstring. "They're not lying," she said. "They're just trying to survive." Rafe didn't speak for a long while. Then, finally, he nodded once. One night, no weapons. The strangers agreed instantly, disarming themselves and accepting food and salves from the elders. The warriors remained nearby, bows in hand, but no arrows were drawn. That night, Clara walked the camp with Swano tucked against her side. Nawi slept in the lodge, curled in a fur cradle. The fire crackled. The children giggled over shared stories. Even Taya, who had once nearly scattered Clara's breath with ash, sat nearby watching quietly. "You keep trusting people," she said not unkindly. Clara smiled. "It's not about trust. It's about refusing to teach my boys fear." Taya held Swano for a moment, letting the baby's small hand curl around her finger. "You bleed different than the others," she said softly. Clara didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth hung between them, warm and quiet. That warmth would soon be tested. 2 nights later, smoke curled over the camp as the fire festival began. It was a sacred night, one of renewal and silent declarations. Clara hadn't expected to be invited, but she dressed simply in a newly woven shawl and tied her hair back with the same feather Rafe had given her days earlier. She stayed at the edges again, rocking the babies to sleep beside the fire. When she looked up, Rafe was gone. Then came the first rumble, distant but heavy. Hoofbeats, again. But this time there was no caution, no hands raised. 5 riders crested the ridge, grimy, armed, and laughing. Clara's blood froze. She knew them. Boone McCready was among them, still wearing that tattered vest, still sneering through broken teeth. "Well, well," he called, sliding from his saddle. "Ain't this cozy? Blondie made it after all." Rafe emerged from the shadow's bow, already strung eyes blazing. "She's not yours," he said flatly. Boone laughed. "She was never mine, but she sure as hell was ours. And now she's got mouths to feed that know a bit too much. We're here to fix that." The tension cracked through the camp like lightning. "You look," Rafe said, raising his voice. "You die." The warriors flanked him. The elders moved children into the lodges. The fire hissed as wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and something more primal fear, but also resolve. Clara didn't hide. She stood beside Rafe, clutching both children to her chest, heart pounding like war drums. Boone took one step forward, but before he could speak again, an arrow thudded into the dirt beside his boot. Not a warning, a promise. The men froze. Boone's grin faltered. "Ain't worth it," one of them muttered. "We go now." They turned and rode hard into the darkness, mud spraying behind them. No one cheered, no one moved. Only the fire flickered, casting long shadows that danced like spirits across the grass. That night, Rafe took Clara and the boys to a narrow cave near the riverbank just in case. He lit no fire, spoke no words. He simply stood outside, soaked in rain, watching. Clara leaned against the wall, knees drawn up, both boys curled beside her. When Rafe finally stepped inside, dripping and shivering, she rose and placed his own coat over his shoulders. "You'll freeze," she said. "I've survived worse," he replied. She hesitated, then added, "You once swore you'd never save someone like me." "I did, but you did." Rafe met her eyes, his voice low. "Because you're not like them. You bled for those boys, but you breathed for them too. That matters." She said nothing, but when he turned and sat at the cave's mouth again, she didn't sleep. She watched him through the night, because sometimes the ones who speak least protect most. By the time spring unfurled its full green across the valley, Clara had stopped counting days. Life had settled into something slower, measured not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the steady rhythm of survival. Swano's laugh when touched by wind, Nawi's quiet humming noises as he chewed on the edge of her shawl. Rafe's silhouette each evening bent over the beginnings of their new shelter. It wasn't much to look at yet. A frame of buffalo hide stretched over bone and cedar poles with a smooth earthen floor and a fire pit ringed with carefully chosen stones. But it stood tall, steady, like the man building it. Clara watched him as she rocked the boys in the field. The sun was soft against her back, and the grass swayed around her legs like ocean waves. She could smell sweet grass and cedar in the air, and something else new beginnings. "You finished?" she asked once Rafe stepped back from the last row of stones. "For now," he said, brushing dust from his palms. She looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, shaped by war and work alike, and then she looked back at his face. "Do you ever think, maybe this wasn't supposed to happen, you and me, this life?" He considered that, shrugged lightly. "Maybe not supposed to," he said, "but needed." She laughed quiet and breathless. "That's not very romantic." "I'm not a romantic man." "No," she replied, stepping closer. "You're better." She reached for his hand, and this time he didn't hesitate. They stood there together in the tall grass with no one watching, no words spoken, just the hush of wind and the warmth of skin against skin. That night, they didn't mark their bond with ceremony. No elders were summoned, no names were exchanged, just a blanket draped over their shoulders and two sleeping infants between them. Rafe sharpened arrows beside the fire, and Clara hummed to the boys. The stars blinked into existence above them, coyotes howling far in the distance. "I used to think survival meant fighting," she said softly. "Proving yourself, winning battles." He said nothing, just kept his eyes on the arrowhead. "But now, I think survival is quieter. It's in the choices you make, not where you came from, but where you choose to stay." She paused. "I didn't choose how I was born, or who hurt me, but I choose this. I choose this land, this tent, these babies. I choose you." Rafe laid down the arrow. His thumb brushed the edge of her hand, warm and sure. "I choose you," he said. "Not because I must, not just for today, but because you are where my soul rests." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he kissed the crown of her hair. Together they watched the fire burn low. Outside, the world spun on. But inside that circle of light, something sacred formed. A family, not of blood or tribe, but of choice. And it was enough. Later, as summer crept in with warm nights and a sky wide enough to hold their future, Clara stood at the edge of the new lodge. Nawi napped on a woven mat, and Swano clung to her hip, grabbing at the fabric of her dress. She turned toward the field, where Rafe was stacking the last bundles of dried corn, preparing for the long months ahead. "Will we stay?" she asked. He didn't answer with words, just walked over, gently, took the sleeping Swano from her arms and carried him inside. She followed, no hesitation, no fear. That evening they ate by the fire stew made from rabbit and herbs. Clara fed the boys first, then herself, then Rafe. They sat close the lodge, warm from shared breath and burning embers. When the fire dimmed, she rocked the babies while Rafe cleaned his tools. There was no talk of plans, no lists of promises, only the understanding that whatever came next, they would meet it together. Rafe paused at the entrance of the lodge, looking out over the moonlit camp. Then, without turning, he said, "I once thought protecting meant keeping everything out." And now Clara asked. He turned eyes soft in the firelight. "Now I think it means letting some things in." She crossed to him, wrapped a shawl around both their shoulders, and leaned into him. A child's laugh echoed in the distance. A fire popped in the hearth. The grass whispered outside. They no longer ran from the world. They had built something worth staying for. In the wild places where law doesn't always reach and survival hangs by a thread, it's not always blood that binds people. It's choice. It's the deliberate, painful, beautiful decision to care, to stay, to rebuild what was broken. Clara and Rafe didn't begin their journey with love. They began with survival, with need, with mistrust and silence and the bruises of old wounds. But what grew between them wasn't built on grand declarations. It was shaped in the everyday a child's fever, a shared meal, the echo of hoofbeats on frozen soil. They learned what many forget, that family isn't always something you're born into. Sometimes it's something you forge. Through fire, through rain, through nights where sleep won't come, and mornings where the light feels like grace. If you've ever felt abandoned, if you've ever wondered if you could rebuild something after everything has burned down, know this: the soil might be scorched, but things still grow, especially when you plant them together. What did this story stir in you? Leave a comment below and tell us. If stories of quiet courage and wild devotion speak to your soul, subscribe to Whispers of the Wild West. We're building something here, tale by tale, heart by heart, because bullets may miss, but the stories that matter always find their mark.